Building your idiolect. Trigger warning here. In order for you to fully appreciate the relevance of the topic, I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you a little bit of context. So please bear with me for a couple of minutes before I get to the actual point. I promise that it will pay off in the end. Okay, let's entertain the notion of a crack team of alien scientists coming to study us. It's not such a wild idea. Do you remember this guy? Well, he was a scientist, a botanist to be exact. But this is not the kind of scientist we need. We need someone proficient in the intricacies of verbal communication. And to me, C3PO, fluent in 6 million forms of communication, is the ultimate hyperpolyglot. Or even the heptapods from The Arrival. They would most likely conclude that we humans share one form of communication, which would make the likes of Professor Noam Chomsky blissfully happy, because he's very well known for being a leading proponent of a theory according to which we humans have an innate set of rules that allows us to develop to acquire languages. Now, the biggest consequence of that is that every language on this planet shares underlying patterns. So, one form of communication. It's been called universal grammar, even though that is a huge oversimplification. But you get my point. The problem is, of course, that not everyone uses that world code in the same manner. And that explains why at the United Nations we still need translators and interpreters. Now, take this Kikuyu speaker and this Lao man. If they chose to engage in a conversation using their respective mother tongues, they would not understand each other, obviously, because they speak different languages. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean that their codes are mutually unintelligible. And this is the key factor, because it's what defines the difference between one language and the other. We find a more relatable example in the Scandinavian series The Bridge, in which a Swedish police officer and a Danish detective have to partner up to investigate a murder together. Now, at no point in the series do they stumble upon problems regarding communication. Their languages are mutually intelligible. Now, this poses a problem because that is not the reputation these two languages have in the region. Swedish and Norwegian have been described as two varieties of the same language, which would outrage many politicians. But anyway, Danish is like the rebellious little sister, is harder to understand, at least in the spoken variety. So what are we supposed to believe? Let's take this jar of tomato sauce that I bought last week. If you check the back label, you will see the list of ingredients in all three languages, in Swedish, in Danish, and Norwegian. Look at the word for onion, look, or something like that. It's strikingly similar, and this is not the only case. You may say, well, that is an anecdotal example. No. Cases like this abound. In printed form, they are very easy to understand. I mean, if you speak one of those three languages, you will understand the other two. In the spoken form, not so simple. So where do you draw the line? This newspaper, this Ladino newspaper, Ladino is Judeo-Spanish, okay? It offers an interesting case to speakers of Spanish. Now, the article reads like this. Al had pasado los restos mortales de los desgraciados señores Menace Catalán y Robert Fresco, que murieron tan tristemente en el terrible accidente de aeroplano, fueron traídos de Atena con avión a Istambul. Now, it is incredibly tempting to state that this is just a dialect of modern Spanish. Why? Well, because if you're a native speaker of modern Spanish, you will understand everything except for the word al-had, which incidentally means Sunday. So the question remains, where do you draw the line between dialect and language? That is the problem. there are no universally accepted criteria for distinguishing those terms, language and dialect. Things get complicated when we look at something like that. It's a map that shows the dialects of Scottish Gaelic. Now, this represents what we call in linguistics a dialect continuum. It is a range of dialects spoken across some geographical area that differ only slightly between neighboring areas. The problem is that those differences accumulate and communication can be compromised. Let's think of a place where they speak dialect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and dialect 7. It would come as no surprise that speakers of 3 and speakers of 4 have no problem understanding each other. The problem comes when speakers of 1 and speakers of 6 can barely understand each other. We had said that intelligibility is what binds dialects together to form a language. And yet, in some cases in the real world, we find that speakers of the same language, theoretically the same language, that can barely understand each other. So how is this all relevant to you, learners of a foreign language? Well, consider that insect. And let's assume that you want to learn language 2, let's call it that. And in this language, you have 4 options. They name the insect with those 4 labels: glowfly, firefly, lightning bug, and glowworm. By the way, no such dialect exists. I mean, those are English terms, by the way, but I don't think there is one dialect on the planet where speakers indistinctly use all 4. Anyway, let's assume that you're just learning English and you come across those words. Which one do you pick? Now, as a native speaker, you don't have much of a choice. You will say whatever your parents teach you, what you say, what you hear your neighbors or what people say in your town. But as a learner of a language, you really have to make a conscious choice. That is one pixel in an enormous picture that we call idiolect. Okay, let's look at another example. Let's imagine that someone is really stressed and you want to ask them to relax. What do you say? I mean, what is the first thing that pops into your head? You say, not so fast, take it easy, calm down. You can always say relax, but let's suppose that you're an advanced speaker and that you have some idioms at hand. Are you going to refer to this and say, keep your pants on? Might not be appropriate if you're talking to someone with those pants, hot pants, and you don't want that mental picture of them thinking that you're considering them taking off their pants. Probably not a good idea, so you resort to this and you say, okay, take a chill pill. Or you want to strike a kind of cool 21st century note and you go and say chillax. But that is too slangy and maybe you're too old for that expression. You have this analogy, like there's the dial and you have to tone it down or dial it down, and you say, okay, dial it down, or dial it down to 5 because it's more specific, or dial it down a notch. Or you go and think of animals like a horse and a tiger and you say, hold your horses, or hey, easy tiger. So the question is, as a learner, you say, what the heck? I mean, what can I say? Which one should I use? Well, that is a very interesting question for which you need to provide an answer. You have to make a choice. Which one is going to be your favorite, your default expression? Another example. You're walking the dog and, through this gorgeous looking field, and you see this. That's a woman sunbathing, all right. The only problem is that she's levitating. So you walk around and you actually see that there is no trickery involved. She is levitating, and you say, that is just what? What is the adjective that springs to mind? What is the first thing that instinctively you will say? Now you can say you're speechless because and you might be entitled to say so because God. But imagine, I would say, well, that is mind-boggling. mind-boggling. But let's just dwell on this for a second. Mind, or you could say mind-bending, which is a variation on that, of course. Some people say mind-blowing. This blows my mind. So again, which is your default expression? Of course, you can resort to all kinds of adjectives, extreme adjectives. But I don't believe that you will have that menu. We're talking about a second or two. In a second, you have to make a choice and say, okay, that's just jaw-dropping or hard to believe, something that is typical of you, something you don't have to think about, all right? So let's put your language skills to the test here. What do you say when something is not good enough? When it's too late for something, when you don't know anything about a subject? When you decide to improvise a course of action, for instance, you say, I don't know what to do. I think I'm going to have to, I will, anything leaps to mind. When something is extremely important to you, what do you say? Or, please pay attention to this, when it's raining a lot, don't say it's raining cats and dogs. Nobody talks like that anymore, okay? But you should have something to say. So idiolects in action is what I call this this menu of 4 different options. You can say to the best of my recollection, which strikes a rather stuffy, formal note. But yes, you might want to sound like that. And you say, well, to the best of my recollection, or if memory serves, still a little bit formal. You can say as far as I remember, or from what I can remember. I personally think I would say, if I remember correctly, there are so many of them, but let's just focus on those. You might argue that the same speaker might use all those 4 depending on the context. That is true. But in this case, let's assume that you say that. As far as I remember, he put on an excellent show, because that's your style. That's how you talk, usually. All right. Roughly speaking, all 4 sentences have the same meaning, but if you realize, look at those color-coded chunks, they have been chosen. They are choices that the speaker has made. I believe that as a learner of a language, you should go down that road. You should have your favorite expression, and you say, well, as far as I remember, okay? Because that's what you feel comfortable with. For instance, that's a good enough reason to me. So let me recap this whole presentation for you. On this planet, we humans use one form of communication whose geographical differences sometimes justify the concept of language. Every language is made up of mutually intelligible dialects, which in turn consist of a multitude of idiolects. And as a native speaker, your circumstances usually dictate the quirks, mannerisms, and idiosyncrasies that you develop. But as a learner of a language, you make the choices. And ultimately, whether you like it or not, those choices define your style, your English, your verbal production, and what we call your idiolect.